Okay, welcome everyone to the University of Texas Energy Symposium for today, November 16th, 2021. I'm Kerry Keene. I'm a research scientist and assistant director of the Energy Institute. So we're happy to have you here with us today. Before I introduce our speaker for today, I will point out the next two talks that are upcoming. The one next week will be in a somewhat similar vein today, Understanding Energy Technology. So this will be Tanya Souza from University of Lisbon. She's going to talk about a time series of understanding technological change over a long period of time, the last 200 years. And then on November 30th, we'll have a panel discussion on energy justice and international development with four folks, including one person here from the University of Texas, Varun Rai, and representatives from the Rockefeller Foundation, World Resources Institute, and a local nonprofit here, Texas Energy Poverty Research Institute. But today, it's my pleasure to have Dr. Anna Broughel. She is the Director of Energy Leadership at the Clean Energy Leadership Institute, and she's also an adjunct lecturer at Johns Hopkins University. She's going to talk to us about technological change and projections, energy projections that we see out there. So a little background on her. She also has taught at University of Maryland prior to joining the Clean Energy Leadership Institute. She was with the engineering firm Tetra Tech as an economist, and she has been an ORISE fellow at the Department of Energy. She's also an Energy Institute fellow here at the University of Texas at Austin. So it's our pleasure to have her speak with us. And it's a pleasure to have her as an Energy Institute fellow. So she's going to tell us about looking at a whole series of 100 energy outlooks over the last few years and tell us what the patterns mean. So I think this is going to be really interesting to me. And she uses the word narrative in her abstract here about they don't have consistent narratives. And I'm all about whether narratives and energy and economic scenarios are consistent or not per my book. So with that said, I'm now going to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Anna. And I'll remind everyone to please submit questions to the question and answer feature of Zoom at any time. And Dr. Broughel is going to attempt to interact and answer those questions throughout her presentation. So she'll be looking at those herself and handling those herself, I believe. And then we'll take some more questions at the end, of course. So with that said, I now hand it over to Anna Broughel.
Thank you, Kerry. It's a great pleasure to be with all of you today. And despite being a UT Austin Energy Institute fellow, I haven't visited Austin ever. So I'm really looking forward for this pandemic to end so I can come and visit UT Austin and meet a lot of my collaborators in person. So it's wonderful to be here. I'm going today talk about research that we have started with DIW Berlin. It's an economic research institute in Berlin. And as Kerry mentioned, feel free to interact through the Q&A button in the chat. I'm all about interaction, and it's wonderful to get to know you folks in the audience. So let us first start about scenario analysis. Why do we care about scenarios and how are those different than outlooks? This is what where we will start today. Scenarios are important because they explore the joint impact of various uncertainties that stand side by side as equals. And I'm going to show you this picture that has an enormous significance to me personally, because I was born in the USSR and I have I've had a very happy childhood, but it was a USSR childhood with some of the struggles that come with that. However, scenario analysis imagined a world back in 1970s where the Soviet Union wasn't around anymore. Basically, it's an opportunity to explore different narratives, and I'm glad that Kerry pointed out narratives, in order to understand potential and plausible energy futures. Sometimes these are the futures we don't want to happen. Sometimes, for example, we'll talk a lot about pandemic today and how this impacted energy scenarios. But sometimes they're the futures that you do want to happen. And this is one of the examples of the USSR falling And nobody imagining this back in the 70s, other than a couple of researchers and scenario planners that were doing this exercise. So it's a foresight method, in other words. However, why do we, again, need scenarios? And sometimes we forget how many cognitive biases we have. As a behavioral scientist, I appreciate how, in a way, gullible our brain is, how we can trick ourselves into believing things, and our prior beliefs can guide our path towards the future. So if you do a quick search on Wikipedia, you will see how many cognitive biases, over 180. And I'm sure that there are more that we will be discovering in the near future. So scenarios help us systematize our thinking and create these narratives, and at least recognize some of the biases that we might hold. So I'm showing you a picture. Anybody knows who this young man is? If you know, you can put it in the chat and I'll see it. He's written one of the most wonderful books. I really enjoyed reading it. Oh, Carrie knows. That's not fair, Carrie. Anybody from the audience, especially the students? That's one of the books I really recommend to all of my students. This is Daniel Kahneman. He's the author of Thinking Fast and Slow. He is a Nobel Prize recipient in economics, and he developed a very influential concept of human brain having two systems. One is the reptilian brain that lives here in the back of your head, that is intuitive, it's unconscious, it's very useful if you run away from a tiger. However, this is sometimes source of our cognitive biases. And this is the world of heuristics. When you think, for example, what kind of light bulb to buy, whether to consume meat today or not, where to invest your money, sometimes we are just looking at, like, letting this reptilian brain run our lives. So what scenarios do, we make ourselves uncomfortable by starting analyzing things and looking at our future in a slow, deliberate, and analytical way. This is the world of mathematics and quantitative reasoning. And again, I will repeat his name. His name is Daniel Kahneman, and he's the author of Thinking Fast and Slow, a book I really recommend for reading. So moving forward, when you're looking at different scenarios, it's very important to figure out where in this bucket, in these three scenario buckets, where does the scenario fall? It could be overlapping, but generally you want to understand what kind of scenario you're looking at. So let me start with modeling scenarios. And UT Austin has a wonderful stream of modeling scenarios that are, for example, organized as a tool. And Carrie, feel free to share that tool's link in our chat. But basically, the idea behind these scenarios is to predict the future with the highest precision possible. I will show you a couple of slides in the next graph. These scenarios are perhaps the most popular among my fellow economists, energy modelers, who want to understand the world with the highest precision, and then they will be looking at different options for this world. However, the idea is to predict the future with the highest precision. That's our first bucket. The second bucket is scenario planning. It is somewhat different in the way that it is qualitative and narrative based. What it allows is looking at the scenario cone, and I will show you the scenario cone, basically all the universe of scenarios, or like all the universe of our potential futures. And this allows us to break away from our usual views on the world, and instead of very probable scenarios, so the most probable scenarios, we are able to incorporate plausible scenarios, such as, will Soviet Union collapse? Will we have a pandemic? And so on. So this is our scenario planning world, where we have also scenarios that are developed under the Shell method. If you look it up, Shell was one of the first companies that popularized this method back in the 80s, and it still remains with the C-suite folks, with energy ministers. There's a long-term energy scenario initiative that is very popular right now. It was started in 2018, where energy ministers are meeting together and figuring out how our energy future will look like. So this is the second kind of scenario. It's more qualitative. And then there is backcasting. Backcasting is are most of the net zero scenarios, 100% renewable scenarios. Basically, you set the target in the future and you try to figure out what do you need to do right now in order to get to the future target. All right. So do you have any questions about these three buckets? So you can still think about it, but when you get to see the scenario, first ask yourself what kind of scenario that is. Is it scenario planning? Is it backcasting? Or we're trying to model the future with the highest precision? Good question from Steve. What does narrative imply? And I'm going to read out these questions because we are also streaming on YouTube, and YouTube folks might not be seeing these questions. Narrative implies an engaging, descriptive story about how the world is going to be like when something changes. For example, Arab Spring happens, or another event that might be changing the world of history, or it might be business as usual. However, we will be able to describe it in terms that do not necessarily mean that the modeling was done without it. However, they're not exactly, I'm not explaining it very well. So they're supposed to be engaging, they're supposed to be plausible, they're supposed to be logical. And usually you create these scenarios when you lock up a bunch of experts for 3 to 5 day sessions, and then they come up with the vision for the future. And I will tell you exactly how the trends and uncertainties are identified. However, the scenarios are both art and science. The narratives are both art and science. There is no like a set in stone prescription of how to write them. I hope that this answers the question. Now, let's for a second stop and appreciate the diversity of players that are in the scenario making field. This could be NGOs, international or domestic. So WWF Japan has their own scenario for energy futures in Japan. There are think tanks. Especially interesting are the ones that are non-Western think tanks. For example, CAPSARC is a Saudi think tank. Skolkovo is a Russian think tank. A lot of their stuff is also in Russian. So there is a little bit of a difficulty to find the same information in English, but it's possible. Then there are newcomers to the space. For example, Deloitte has published their first long-term energy scenario in 2020. And I believe they will release something in 2021. We have to be patient and wait for it. Then international organizations, and we all know IPCC and IA scenarios, and of course energy companies that are the closest to the industry itself and understand, say, technology trends. Now, to the question how a narrative's done, before we even start with a narrative, we have to create that framework. And first of all, when you're creating a scenario, you start with understanding uncertainties. And the next slide, we will discuss what uncertainties do we have in our energy systems and about energy systems future. The second one is defining megatrends. And only then we pick a couple of drivers. For example, very popular drivers are technologies and policies. It could be technology and international collaboration. It could be technology and the likelihood that the European Union is going to stay together. This was used by a scenario exercise I have done recently with the Estonian government. So these are the first couple of steps. So before we start, let's think about megatrends. If you could drop in the chat, what megatrends do you know? Okay, so exactly, population growth. We're increasing our energy consumption due to that population growth. Thank you, Carrie. So urbanization is a megatrend. So energy efficiency increase over time. Forest, I believe this is what you wanted to say. Energy usage, exactly, Marka. EV tech goes in the very, like in the nitty gritty. If we're talking about mega trends, we're just looking at the big picture. I would say is still GDP growth. We're still growing, economies are growing, we're getting richer. So yeah, so these are all the good stuff. Let's look at the uncertainties as well. So when we think about our global energy systems, and I just added a couple of pictures to inspire you to think about them. So once the researchers have defined these megatrends, the next step is try to figure out what the more nitty-gritty steps are and what are uncertainties around them. So anybody wants to venture a guess what this circle might represent? Exactly, rural electrification. Thank you, Michael. Not necessarily with renewables, but just in general. So the picture you can see is an off the grid electrification with home solar system. However, there are multiple options for that. Now it's possible to extend the grid or do a microgrid in different locations. However, yes, this is the rural electrification piece that before we start writing the narrative, we have to identify and then think about uncertainties. Like, do we have understanding of what are the financial flows? How quick will this technology be accepted by the rural folks? How will it be used? For example, will they actually understand how to utilize it and not be afraid of it? Maybe they think that this will attract lightning and thunder, which, for example, I have experienced as one of the reasons that were given to me by some rural folks in Mexico, why they said that they're not trusting solar panels because they were afraid that the lightning will strike them. So I will reveal the whole slide with different energy global trends, and I'm sure you're aware of all of them. The one that I am specifically going to focus today is digitalization of energy systems, and how we might think about digitalization as a tool to get us closer to net zero. And what do scenarios actually have to say about that? So moving forward, let me tell you more about the research that we have conducted. So we cast a really wide net and came back with 120 outlooks that are not older than year 2017. We could have collected more. However, our idea was to look at energy outlooks that at least have two different scenarios in them. Because if it's only one outlook, there's only one pathway to the future, but we were interested in how folks are looking at different views. And let me see in the chat. Oh yeah, thank you, Carrie, for putting this energy futures dashboard. It's a great resource. I let my students always play with it. It's one of the ways to check how can we get to our goals. But back to our outlooks. We looked at outlooks that had more than one energy future envisioned in them. Otherwise, we would have ended up with even more. And we we have seen that all the outlooks make certain assumptions. It's either about population growth, economic growth, importantly about energy intensity of GDP and trade. If you hear what some of the latest things of what Amy Jaffe has published on energy's digital future, she also always mentions that in the past, if we have increased our oil consumption by 1%, we would also increase our GDP by 1%. So in the future, will we able to decouple that, or will we still be very, very dependent on energy, especially the fossil energy as our input? So main insights from scenarios, and I'm caveat, most of my work is in renewable energy technologies. However, I understand that UT Austin folks might have very different like specializations in different technologies. So it was interesting to read that all of these scenarios from all over the world unanimously see that there will be growth in renewable energy. So it means I won't be out of work, which is great. Also increased energy efficiency. This was to the comment above that insinuated that maybe we'll have decreased energy efficiency. So the outlooks in their entirety are mostly talking about increased energy efficiency and high degree of electrification, really big. However, most, if not all, the scenarios mention some sort of negative carbon technology, and it could be bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. It could be other technologies, but basically we will have to employ these if we're serious about the 2050 net zero targets. So it will be pretty much impossible to achieve those without some sort of direct air capture or another CCUS technology. I'm waiting comments in the chat about that. Still nothing? All right. There's been a big difference between weird and non-weird countries. And does anybody know what weird, when it's capitalized, stands for? I will give away the first. W is Western. Okay. Western, educated. Western, educated, industrialized. Democratic, yes. And R stands for, yes, Kyle, Republican, no, rich. I'm joking. So it's Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic country. So basically the US and Australia and Canada and most of the OECD countries can be characterized as weird countries. So there was a big difference reading scenarios coming out of Russia. And thanks to my background, I was able to read them in their original version. For example, Russia is really obsessed about the state of the world in nuclear. And they are creating several scenarios where in one scenario, Russia is the world leader in nuclear power, and they create different scenarios where Russia is lagging behind India and China. And this is clear from the way that this narrative is written that it's really worrying for the author if, for example, Russia is not the world leader in nuclear. Well, if you read other scenarios, nuclear is mentioned somewhere, maybe in passing, that yes, we will keep operating these plants, or yes, we're going to phase them out. Maybe a little bit about small modular nuclear reactors, but not much. So with this consideration, it's also interesting to observe that our non-weird countries are more open to some of the digital technologies, at least in their scenarios, at least in their scenario thinking. And I'll show you more evidence for that. So another interesting thought is that putting our 100% renewable and net zero scenarios aside, which already have a target, that's why they're able to achieve it. Most other scenarios show that we're not going to be meeting our Paris targets to keep global warming well below 2 degrees. And if we do meet these targets, maybe not by 2050, but by 2070, 2080. So one of the messages that I wanted to communicate with this presentation of, if we are really serious about our 2050 commitments, how difficult technologically, economically, and in many other ways would that be, it would be very difficult for us to get there. So by 2050. Maybe 2070, 2080 is realistic, and I don't want to be a Debbie Downer. If you take your time to read some of the net zero scenarios, to me, they a lot of the times they read like science fiction, and I'm an optimist. I think we could get there. However, we will need some real big technological progress to get there, so that what we will be willing living with is not going to be feeling like it's a science fiction. Let's for a moment stop and appreciate the differences in scenario outputs. So this wonderful graph was published by Ansari et al. In 2020 in one of the US Association for Energy Economics journals, EEP. So here you can see how folks from the World Energy Council, for example, these three, or from Equinor and MIT or Exxon, and DIW's own scenarios, how they're differing with respect to primary energy demand. Most of these scenarios agree that primary energy demand by 2025 is going to go up. So it's just a question of by how much. Now let's recognize that historically, we've been very, very bad as energy economists at predicting or forecasting how exactly our consumption is going to look like. So, and I like to joke that if you put together a bunch of economists in the room, especially those who are doing predictions, and you want them to have a good conversation, let's let them start on criticizing the latest IEA forecasts or publications, because everybody will have a lot to say about those. But basically, you can see that coal consumption has been very much over-predicted. And in 2018, the curve has flattened quite a bit. And on the contrary, PV additions have been historically under-predicted. So in a sense, a lot of the scenarios that we are reading now, I shouldn't say a lot, probably all of them, are not going to pan out the way they're predicted. However, this is our best way of analytically think about what the future might bring. Now I'm going to talk about our net zero scenarios. Let's again ask the audience. According to the UN calculations and DNV calculations, what is the annual % of reductions in emissions that we need to see in order to meet our Paris Agreement targets? So, if we are here in 2021 right now, and here's 2050, by how many percent, and it can be a linear, just let's draw a line between the two, emissions there, emissions here, like net zero. But more or less, how much do we need to decrease every year to get where we think we need to be by 2050? And feel free to put the number in the chat. Yes, your guys are great. So exactly 7.6%, 8% per year. These are the numbers that seem to be the consensus right now. So here I'm putting a big 8% as a number, so it like burns into our subconscious reptilian mind. But basically, what are we seeing after the pandemic hit? Have we actually reached 8% reductions even in 2020? Have these 8% reductions stuck around for 21 to get us to the Paris targets, even in the situation of the pandemic? I mean, like nobody is traveling much, and the economies have slowed down. So you might know the answer. Let me just show you this slide first. In the reality, global energy demand has increased. So it's set to increase by 4.6% in 21, after a contraction of 4% in 2020. So remember the previous slide, the 8%? So we contracted, so last year was like an incredible year for in many ways. So only due to that, we were able to contract decrease our energy demand by 4%. Basically, what I'm trying to show is the big disconnect between what we need to do with respect to emissions and energy demand that's continuing to grow. And importantly, it's growing in emerging economies. So it's hard for me to accept, but a lot of the stuff that we folks in the developed world are doing, it is important, but still the demand is in the emerging markets. Fossil fuel demand is also set to grow significantly in 21, and even coal consumption is predicted to be back to its 2014 peak. The great news, of course, is renewables. The share is rising, and it has achieved 8%. So we got 8%, but only in renewables, only in power sector, which is a limitation, obviously. And in addition to energy demand in total, we also are looking at electricity demand growth in the next 10 years. These numbers are all from Global Energy Review 2021 by IEA. We're looking at the second largest annual increase in energy, and we still seeing the transportation oil demand hasn't picked up, but partially because of our travel restrictions. So I wanted to wrap it up to show you how much technology do we need in order to actually solve the puzzle of the net zero by 2050. So if we keep the current technology, how quickly do we need to add capacity in order to solve our existing energy problem? And I'm not even talking about like grid stabilization issues or other issues. It's like, how much do we need to produce and how much do we need to capture? It looks like we need to build the largest solar park every 2 days from now on to 2050 to get to our targets. We would need to build the largest electrolyzer in operation today every hour. And then finally, in order to eliminate some of the emissions, we need to build and capture CO2 in a project of the size of the Northern Lights every week. So this graph had a huge influence on me because it's very clear to me that it will be impossible to do this. So there might be some other solutions that we need to pursue, or option number one is that option number two is that we're just not going to get to our emissions targets, and we'll have to accept that and do something else, or say that we will get there by 2070 or 2080. We don't know if this will be too late with respect to climate change in our nature, tipping points and other things, because this is one of the uncertainties, but it looks like with current technology, we are in a little bit of a trouble. Now, let me move forward the screen. Now let's think a little bit about our pandemic and how this has changed the world we live in. Imagine a situation where a mutated SARS virus emerges in East Asia over the winter. Travelers spread the virus worldwide, with first cases appearing in Europe and in America around April. Governments exercise different containment policies, including various forms of lockdowns and travel bans. And the virus shows a high number of symptomatic patients and has a significant incubation time, making containment virtually impossible. And finally, the virus advances and becomes increasingly endemic, with society making drastic turns towards social distancing and hygiene policies. What did I just read it to you? Basically, what could this be a description of? It is history. Okay, thanks, Julie. It's our past 2 years. That's exactly how I felt reading this. It's a scenario. Thank you, Forrest. So it is indeed a scenario. It has been developed by, by Robert Koch Institute in Germany that advises the German parliament, and it has been developed in 2012. If you dig deep enough, you can find similar scenarios developed by American Airlines. FEMA has developed a scenario where pandemic was part of the 9 terrible things that can happen to the US. It had like an earthquake and other natural disasters. And you read these scenarios and you understand that, yes, we knew that this might happen. However, we haven't done much about it. So now imagine if instead of a negative thing, we might actually have something positive in our, like a positive tsunami of technology. And how this will change our inability or current inability to meet our Paris targets. This is where I'm trying to get with you. I promised to show you the scenario cone and the different scenarios that are contained in there. So everything beyond the red cone is a possible. Inside the blue, it's possible. And then the green scenario is a plausible. So what most of the scenarios that we have reviewed looked at, they looked only at possible energy futures. There was not a single scenario that we have reviewed prior to 2020 that even considered a pandemic that came out from the energy, one of the big energy players that I've mentioned in the previous slides. Scenarios with pandemic were developed by a security community, by FEMA and other agencies that deal with natural disasters or health crises. But basically, we are very comfortably contained in our imagination of the future in this pretty narrow part of the cone, which is the plausible scenarios. So I would like to, and the most probable one is often described in the scenario narrative. There could be a preferable scenario. This is our 2050 world, for example, and then there are wildcards. And our pandemic was a wildcard. It didn't last with respect to as an impact. We don't want the pandemic to be the reason why we reach our 2050 targets. We want something positive, something that will still enable good quality of life and our growth, economic growth in the world, everywhere in the world, not only in the developed countries. So maybe we just need a wildcard. We started reviewing what these wildcards could be and bumped into the idea of general purpose technologies. So they are technologies that change the world as we know it, and they have a bathtub effect. So if you fill up the bathtub, everything goes up a notch. So they have profound impacts on many systems, not only on energy. And the past examples include steam engine, electricity, and internet. Some research on GPTs has shown that they spur economic growth, And also prior research has shown that this might require public leadership to get this technology to the level where it will be useful to the whole population. So we started investigating what could be the next GPT, because it seems that we are unable to meet our targets with current technologies. And there seems to be a little bit of direction of artificial intelligence being one of such technologies. And then we also thought that artificial intelligence, we still are, look, we don't have AGI, we don't have a technology that can intelligently solve tasks like humans do. We have a narrow artificial intelligence technology. So we started looking into the whole digitalization sector. And we created a list of keywords that included smart grid and autonomous and data mining and robotics and digital twins and big data, smart and automation. Basically brainstormed all of the fancy buzzwords that we have heard about digitalization and digitalizing energy systems. And we ran it through the outlooks that we have collected, and only 46 out of 120 outlooks even mentioned one of the keywords that we looked at. Most of these outlooks were from non-weird countries, and there were only several outlooks here by OPEC, REN 21, or IRENA that had actually went beyond one or two sentences on AI and actually considered it in any depth at all. Now, then we created a word cloud. Which words were actually that are connected to digitalization were mentioned? And most of the time it's just the word digitalization. It's like, yeah, we sort of want to get there, and this will make our energy consumption cheaper. Our supply chains will work better. We'll be there just in time. We will have drones that are going to fly over wind turbines and do maintenance there, or offshore rigs. We'll have robots diving for us in the ocean and doing a lot of the maintenance of underwater cables and so on and so forth. So what we have found that a lot of these were discussed in a very, very general way. So if we had more in-depth discussion of existing technologies, the scenarios were really stuck in their, like, I can say, path dependency of looking at the things that they have previously looked at. Now, if we think about, now let's not think about digital technologies. Let's think about any energy source that that could have been mentioned in the scenarios. Do you want to venture a guess which sources were the most popular? I will show you another word cloud, but basically what sources of energy do you think were the most popular in these scenarios? I hear solar. Carrie is also saying solar or PV. And these are not only 100% renewable scenarios. CCUS, thank you. Nuclear and batteries and nuclear again. You haven't mentioned the biggest one yet. Hydrogen, that will be very big. Bio. Autonomous cars or cars, EVs. Thanks, Julie. Geothermal of wind. You still haven't mentioned the biggest one. Come on, Texas. Transmission. Oil. Okay, more. Please give me more. What else in addition to oil? Natural gas. Thank you, Forrest. You and Brandon. You guys are saving the day today. Thank you. So I'm going to show you without further ado how this looked like. So the most scenarios we're focusing on gas and storage. And then hydrogen seems to be still this up and coming story that gets the attention. I'm not a hydrogen expert, so unfortunately I won't be able to answer a lot about hydrogen. Seems like there are a lot of debates about it right now, but you can see also negative carbon technologies, CCUS, CCS, DAC. We have had solar here, but see, oil is pretty small. And nuclear and SMRs are also mentioned, onshore, offshore wind, and even floating technologies. Obviously, energy efficiency and energy access and off-grid were also often mentioned together. Batteries and storage are obviously connected, but you can see that we're still looking at the future of natural gas with all of these other existing technologies sort of around it. So what is my conclusion? And my co-author and I have published a little blog post at ourenergypolicy.org. It's a fun little website if you want to go and check them out. We find that no one anticipated a pandemic, and so it's not very surprising that scenarios that haven't anticipated a negative wildcard would not be very likely to be anticipating positive development, such as new technological boom or a new technological solution. And the other thing is that even if we know that something might happen, for example, Texas freeze might happen, a pandemic might happen, it doesn't mean that we'll actually take action on it. So here we summarized a couple of criticisms of our fellow scenario and foresight folks, that energy scenarios seem to be very focused on the small subset of what their energy world is doing. There's not much evidence that energy folks are reading a lot of scenarios that are like outside of their expertise, say in health. Maybe now they're doing more of that, but before the pandemic, it seemed like very structured way of going about things without including possible shocks. These are black and white swans that Nassim Taleb likes to talk about, and that new technologies are often integrated just in the buzzword style. And all of this might create path dependencies of us not being able to find plausible futures that we might still be able to experience, but that we are really confined to this very narrow part of our scenario cone. So just to summarize, and let me see how much time I have used up. Oh, it's so fast presenting. That's great. It means we'll have a lot of time to discuss. So we're not meeting our Paris targets. We've looking at the scenarios that are not net zero scenarios by definition. We're still witnessing rising emissions in most of these scenarios, even though we know that we have to reduce them by around 8% a year. Technological improvements that we're having right now, or even that are outlined in scenarios that are net zero scenarios, marginal technological improvements are not enough right now. When you look at scenarios that are projecting similar pathways into the future, however, if you read net zero scenarios, technological improvements there seem to be pretty out of reach. And again, this is my opinion. What we could have is perhaps somewhere in the lab, we already have a necessary new technology that just needs to be commercialized, needs to be utilized. And the enormity of technological challenge is really great. To reach to our targets by 2050 would have to build out infrastructure very, very quickly. And I don't see that happening really. And of course, there was this big elephant in the room: how do we ensure equitable transitions? And most of the scenarios really don't discuss that either. All right, so my input spiel is done. I see a couple of questions in here. I hope that I'll be able to answer some of them. So Carrie, what are we doing next?
Right. Well, you can, I don't know, I'll take the prerogative and maybe ask a question myself. But then, yeah, you can answer the questions that are showing up in the Q&A and still some in the chat. But your sort of slide here, I guess, really led to my question. Bullet number 3 there, marginal technology improvements are not enough, need a breakthrough. So sort of question, do scenarios allow high-level people, politicians, people at companies to essentially put off decision-making, right? So that with the current technology, your statement is, well, you've got to do this great number of installations every day to do what you say we want to do, yet you're not doing it. So are we just waiting for the breakthrough? Does the scenario say, well, I'm going to plan on a breakthrough coming instead of do something now? Is that letting people get off the hook, or us, and not people, or how do we think about that? Or the time frame of scenarios, right? Is it 1 year or 100-year kind of thing?
Most of the scenarios at the moment run until like 2040, 50, 70, 80. There are just a few of them who run to 2100. So 2050 seems to be like a normal time frame for them, but every single scenario is different in the length of time that they're looking at and their assumptions. So it's really hard to bring them all together, except for some of the trends that you're seeing. So I would turn around the view that you have suggested, Carrie, that it allows us to postpone things. To me, it actually shows how quickly we need to act, and that if we're not possible to solve it, the only thing that could potentially save us is a wild card that we hope that exists, but we're not quite sure. And another thing, it shows me the necessity to go to the drawing board and look at the things that are on the verge of commercialization in the lab. So for example, the work that NREL is doing in commercializing new technologies, or ARPA-E, or angel investors, how they are investing into these new ventures. This is where my thinking is going, that actually it shows the necessity of more innovation and faster innovation.
Right. You want to just read and answer the questions that you see?
Sure.
Or some Q&A and chat? Do it.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I can see some really fun ones. I will answer a quick question by Steve. He's asking, do scenarios consider things like politics and public opinions? So scenarios definitely consider politics. It is often one of the drivers in the scenarios. So remember one of the previous slide I've showed you when there was an x-axis and y-axis, often politics is one of the main axes according to which scenarios are been drafted. And if you look at some of the publications by World Energy Council, for example, they're specifically talking about whether China and America will be getting along. And then there is a scenario that they have developed. Will China and America not get along? And here's another scenario. Will, say, China just become a world leader? And here's a scenario for you. So basically, politics and public opinions are integrated in a lot of these scenarios. However, energy scenarios, a lot of the times, if you're looking at, say, modeling scenarios, then they're often not incorporating these things because they're thinking more like the economy and technology. However, economy is obviously impacted by politics as well. There are two questions about artificial intelligence, which are great. Okay, let me take those. So Michael is asking, what are some specific applications of AI to improve generation efficiency from renewables? What are the top 2-3 technologies that have real potential to cause structural paradigm shift and breakthrough in energy future? So we have actually created an expert solicitation on this topic. And now that you're asking, I'm desperately trying to remember what were the top 2-3 technologies. I might owe you this answer, Michael. because we have separated it actually in 3 buckets. So technologies that are already here and they're mature and they're accepted, technologies that are immature, very high potential, but are difficult to be accepted, for example, geoengineering technologies. And then technologies that are mature, but might have low social acceptance. For example, will people actually accept an individual cap on individual emissions? Like it would be perfectly possible to build an app that would track all of your movements, track all of your consumption, and then say, here's your carbon budget for the year. And artificial intelligence, by tracking you, by scanning things that you're consuming, will be able to look at your carbon footprint. But this would have very low social acceptance. So if that is okay, Michael, I will send you a summary later because I'm really don't remembering the top several of them off the top of my head. Okay. What is the current state of using AI in renewables? Going to give an example where AI is currently used. So again, we're talking about narrow artificial intelligence. These are specific applications that are used for different sectors. Sorry, used in the same sector to perform a very defined little task. And they're excellent in performing at this task. However, you can't take the same program or AI and put it on a different task and it will learn by itself. So we haven't quite figured out how to do that. For example, if we train AI to play the game of chess, it will, or game of Go, it will be very good only at this game. It will beat human grandmasters, but it won't be able to, say, regulate electricity on our grid. So we're very, very far away from the generalized artificial intelligence. With respect to your question, it really depends on the sector. For example, in wind energy, we are very good at predicting. We're very good at using machine learning models in order to predict energy production. We're great at predicting maintenance needs with drones. You fly a drone instead of a person. We're great at switching on wind turbines if there is a computer vision algorithm that is scanning the sky and sees, for example, a bald eagle. And we know that bald eagles are endangered. You cannot take a bald eagle, so wind turbines can practically switch themselves off. So I've heard of applications like that. It doesn't mean that all of wind developers are using them. They're still perhaps expensive, but we're getting there to be able to utilize these technologies. Virtual power plants are a good example. All sorts of peer-to-peer trading options that go with that are examples of machine learning and how machines help us make sense of these high volumes of information. Basically, every sector has a set of their own artificial intelligence applications that you're using now or will be using, say, 5 years from now. Yeah, Forrest. Let's quickly talk about emerging markets. It's a great question. Forrest is asking that 70% of future emissions are coming from emerging markets, and what's the optimal approach to curb this trend? So the only vision I see is technological leapfrogging. And I've traveled extensively in India, done research in Mexico. Leapfrogging has been already documented for other technologies. For example, mobile phones, they have leapfrogged landlines, and often the population has adopted a newer technology faster. So we could see a future where technologies will be, say, developed in the US or Germany and immediately used if we figure out how to make them cheap enough, immediately utilized in the developing world. And India is doing so well on renewables. It's just that they're also investing in other polluting energy sources that at the moment they can't meet all of their demands with renewables. So that is the problem. Another problem is just also an educational problem. I've worked in Cameroon a little bit, and we wanted to install and electrify off-grid locations. What we came across is an absolute zero number of electricians that could help us with solar. So what we did first is actually opened a little solar educational facility, educated the electricians, and then we were able to bring solar panels. Otherwise, if they break, so nobody knows how to install them, how to maintain them. So it's very important to think about the whole supply chain. So I hope that tech transfer could be one of the solutions. And hopefully we will get to a way to do this transfer with a common share understanding. And I know this sounds like I'm a big optimist, but with a common share understanding that we need these technologies to scale really fast to avert climate change and potential terrible impacts that will happen if we don't. Another thought, Forrest, is about carbon markets. I actually really think that carbon markets, especially voluntary carbon markets, have a big potential. And that if we are successful in transferring the funds from developed economies, for example, the Microsofts and Googles of the world, or other tech companies that are, ESG is so big right now, so every company will have some sort of an ESG commitment, and it's very hard to imagine that all of them will be able to decarbonize their supply chains, and it's very hard and expensive to do carbon projects at home. So what I've seen, some of the carbon investment is actually happening in developing countries, Brazil, Kazakhstan, and American investors are investing abroad in order to make this happen. So that's another example of capital transfer and knowledge transfer from us here in the West to folks who can actually do this mitigation much cheaper than we are able to do that. Oh yeah, Jeffrey, you're asking a good question about energy conservation. I do believe there are still opportunities in energy conservation. Looking at some of the latest papers that are coming out in economics and energy economics, it still seems that our negawatt, or the negative watt, is the cheapest source of energy. And if you think about negawatt, there's so many benefits to not using that marginal kilowatt of electricity. And excuse me. For example, if we have benefits to the people, so to a consumer, we're not paying for that electricity. We have benefits to the grid, because the grid will not be so congested, so overloaded by demand. And then we also have benefits to society, that there are no emissions to be taken care of. So I actually think that energy efficiency is like an unloved child in energy economics. If you, for example, go Google webinars that have been put out by the International Association for Energy Economics, and you Google energy efficiency. I tried doing that recently, and there were exactly 0 webinars on that topic. This topic has been baked into other topics, say transportation and buildings. And however, energy efficiency is indeed the low-hanging fruit. However, In order to change that, we have to change our behavior. And this is where our reptilian brain has its own opinions, because it's hard to do energy efficiency. We have to incentivize it. And I just paid attention that we have gone longer than an hour. Carrie, why didn't you stop me? I will keep
because it's
blabbering.
fine. Because it's fine if we go a little bit more. So yeah, yeah, we can answer a couple more of these, or we can call it
Sure.
here, or what have you. So yeah, it's fine.
Yeah,
Fine to continue for another 5 minutes. It's fine.
Let me read a comment by Mirka, which seems interesting. I don't know if I have an answer. She's writing that recently there has been a big pushback from governments to an increasing energy share for natural gas, even when it is relatively clean, cheap, and abundant source. I recently read that the US increased their coal use by 20% last year. Exactly. This was because the year before was the pandemic year, Mirka. That's just the year-to-year comparison. Isn't contradictive to hyper-regulate and refine natural gas production when wanting to reduce emissions. Yeah, Mirka, natural gas has been viewed as, so to say, the bridge fuel. And some people say that this is a bridge to nowhere. And recently, and I believe this also came out of the UT Austin, there's been great research on methane flaring. And if you look at the latest climate pledges, there was a huge methane pledge. Basically, methane is an issue. It's clean. At the same time, if it escapes, then we're in big trouble. And it looks like it's escaping quite a lot of times. We're still unsealed wells. And methane is very, very potent gas. So it is, I believe, 80% more potent than CO2. And then it sticks around at the atmosphere, in the atmosphere as CO2 after it's done being methane after a while. So while it being a local energy source for the US, I believe for the US, it doesn't make a lot of sense. For example, look at the EU. The reason why they still have to deal with Russia is partially because they're depending on the natural gas, and I'm from the region. The anxiety is really high about that. So the fact that the U.S. is blessed with natural gas is really, it's an amazing boon for the economy, and we have benefited from that. It could be seen as the next best alternative to coal. But then we need to start thinking is how do we get the CO2 that still natural gas is emitting? How do we get that out of the atmosphere? Is there a good system that works with both? And Christian, I've seen your questions about bioenergy. Unfortunately, not a big, I'm not an expert on bioenergy, so I'll have to, I will not be able to answer that one. Mirka, another thought that I had to this, because you're correctly asking, why are we regulating and trying to kill something that has been such a boon to our economy? Another thing that I'm thinking about is nuclear. So in the last year, after I have done this research, it became pretty clear to me that we need something big, cheap, predictable, and amazing that could help us decarbonize really quickly. And while I hope that Mark Jacobson is right and we can all do this with water, wind, and solar, this is his vision, that we just can do it with these three technologies, maybe with a little bit of battery storage on top of that too. In general, I started changing my mind about nuclear as a viable source of carbon-free electricity. So nuclear is a whole nother topic for a whole nother webinar. However, in line with your thinking, Mirka, I thought it's worth mentioning. It's like we are trying to, maybe we should bring some of this nuclear technology discussion back. Yes,
right.
Thank you.
I think I'll add to the Mirka's question on, we'll, here in Texas at least, we'll be rethinking how cheap we think natural gas is, as I think we're collectively responsible for paying $3.5 billion of over gas payments from the Texas freeze, and I guess we'll be paying that off over the next 10 years or so. I think in my house, I don't have gas heating, so I think I spend something like $5 or $10 a month on gas for cooking. So I'll just double that just to pay off the costs from the freeze. I think we'll end it there. So thank you all for asking several questions to Anna Broughel, and thank you for being diligent and answering them and sharing your thoughts. And I thought they were very interesting thoughts on the ways to think about scenarios and systematic, and how we can understand what we're reading when we read these other reports. So officially, again, thank you very much, Anna Broughel, from the Director of Energy Leadership at the Clean Energy Leadership Institute.
Thank you all. Follow me on LinkedIn.